and the first part is spent addressing the problem of violence in America. Violence is on the increase, as we're all aware. Many of you would not have really been thinking about doing this 10, 15 years ago, but because things are getting worse and worse, we've finally been pushed to a point in our country where people see the need to arm themselves against the imminent threat of loss of life, serious injury, or sexual assault. So I'm going to be talking about the problem of violence and actually what's driving the violence problem, so that we can understand what we can do about it as American citizens, because ultimately everything that pertains to our way of life is ultimately our responsibility, because we live in a country where the government is you and me. We live in a country that is the envy of the world because of our way of life. And what is it about our way of life that would make it the envy of the world? It's what's called unalienable rights, unalienable individual rights of American citizens. Another thing that makes this nation the envy of the world: we do not live under a dictator. We do not live under an oligarchy, just a small group of people that tell us how we're going to live and define our freedoms for us. No. What rules over this country is not a man. What rules over this country is a document called the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of the United States. And the reason is because we've got a country where the government is of, by, and for the people. That is very unusual and it's very unique, and as a matter of fact, is why one of the major things in this upcoming election is the need for a wall. Why? Because people will risk their life to get into this country because it's the envy of the world. People would do anything to live in a country like this. And so what makes it so unique is the fact that the government is of, by, and for the people. We are the government. But we've got a nation of people that do not understand that, because the public education system is actually depriving, and has deprived a couple of generations now, of a thorough knowledge of what it is to be an American. Very few students know anything about the Founding Fathers, know very little about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And as a result, everybody has begun to look to Washington for our well-being, when our well-being originally and always has been safeguarded by the people. The government is of, by, and for the people. It's not of, by, and for Washington. It's not of, by, and for the legislature in Raleigh. We are the government. And so part of my passion in teaching these classes is to try to stir up some people in my little corner of the world with what understanding that I have gained over the years, to help people realize what we've got to do to get our country back. And the first thing we've got to do is look to ourselves, because it's our solemn responsibility is to safeguard our way of life. Government of, by, and for the people. So the first part of this class is going to be dedicated to explaining the violence problem and ultimately the reasons that have brought you here. You may know in a certain way why you're here, but I'm going to try to put some words to some of your feelings about what's going on in this country, in the hopes that maybe it'll mean something to you. I'm going to weave all of this into what you can legally do in the use of deadly force to protect yourself against the imminent threat of loss of life, serious bodily injury, or sexual assault. I'm going to teach you what you can legally do in North Carolina. Keep in mind that the laws in the various states do differ, but the advantage of taking this class, if you're living in North Carolina, is you're going to know what the laws are in North Carolina. And so we're going to cover all of that this morning in the first half of this class. We're going to take a 30-minute break for lunch, and then we're going to come back in here and I'm going to take you through an abbreviated NRA basic pistol shooting course. After we finish that up, I'm going to try to get us out of here by around 3 with our classroom stuff finished up, and we're going to go to the Moore County Wildlife Club where we will continue the instruction. In getting into the first part of this class, I want to inform you up front that I'm probably one of the most politically incorrect people you're going to encounter. I could care less what your station in life is, if you're a Supreme Court judge, or if you're a lawyer or a doctor. Those kinds of things matter little to me in terms of who is in this class in view of what I'm going to say. And I don't want to come across as an arrogant somebody, because I certainly do not want to be. But I tell you what, and I don't know for what you share some of my feelings, I'm tired of being pushed around. I really am. I'm fed up with this government. I'm fed up with political correctness. I'm fed up with people trying to tell me how to think, that a lot of times runs roughshod over just plain good common sense. And so let me explain to you some of where I'm coming from. I'm 71 years old. About 7 years ago, I had a heart attack. I fell over on the floor in my office, and I did not suspect such a thing because I've always been healthy. I've never been to the doctor really for anything. And the day that I had the heart attack, I could do 35 push-ups. I could do squat jumps. You know, I was in what I thought was pretty good shape. But you can think you're in good shape and not be in good shape. Anyway, it wasn't that experience that caused me to say what I'm fixing to say to you right now. I just know that I'm terminal. I know that. One of these days I'm going to leave this world. It could be sooner, it could be later. I'm not really that bothered one way or another. But I'll tell you one thing. When it comes to what is important in life, I'm tired of being pushed around by political correctness. And so some of the things I'm going to say to you this morning have to do with some things that I've learned over the years, over my years in this world. I'm going to try to present some thoughts to you that cannot really be refuted. There is actually a way that you can discuss certain subjects, and no one is going to be able to say, well, I don't agree with that, or that doesn't make sense. I'm going to try to say everything I say this morning in a way that's going to be compelling. It's going to make sense, And the reason is because there's a way that you can discuss certain things where people can't really disagree with it. The founders of this country conceived of such a thing. They called it natural law. I'll give you an example, would be the law of gravity. The law of gravity. There might be 3 people in here or more that would say, well, I got a different understanding about gravity than that. Or I don't agree with your definition of gravity. And I can defy gravity and get away with it and so forth because I'm the center of meaning and explanation and not anything outside myself. Well, I beg to differ because the law of gravity doesn't care what you think. You're subject to the law of gravity. And if you try to defy the law of gravity or redefine it in such a way that it sort of moves aside so that you're more important than it is, you're going to lose. And so there is such a thing as inherent truth, where the truth is in itself. It's in the truth that is being declared. And it's in that sense that I want to try to bring some thoughts to you. I want you to understand that there are some things that you can say that are just inherently true. And everybody would sort of have to, when thinking about it, agree, it is true. In order to develop some of these thoughts, I need to tell you just a little bit about me. I'm a farm boy. I was brought up on a farm in Johnson County, North Carolina. I grew up in a community that's a lot like that cast on the Andy Griffith Mayberry program. I never heard of violence when I was growing up. As a matter of fact, we never even owned a key to the house that I lived in. Some of you can remember a time like that in your life, some of you older ones. I never recall my parents locking the doors. I never recall seeing a key to our house at all. I never recall kids shooting their parents or parents shooting their kids. I do not recall in the years that I attended the public school, kids going to school and shooting other children. I don't remember a single incident of that. Just to put things in perspective, I actually came along when there were no TVs. I can remember as a small child the first television that was ever owned in our community. It was a small black and white TV purchased by Ernest Woodard, who ran a country filling station where all the farmers would drive by with their pickup trucks and their tractors and so forth and fill up with gas and maybe buy a nickel Pepsi Cola out of the Pepsi box. I can remember when there were no air conditioners. I can remember when no one on the road that I lived on, which was the Creech Mill Road, had indoor plumbing. Everybody had an outhouse. Some of you may remember those days. I don't know. But the reason I'm mentioning these things is because I want to present a perspective. I want to present a perspective of change. From a time when we did not have these conveniences like we have today, to the day that we now live in where we got so many conveniences. The generation that has recently come along, I actually think Adam and Eve had cell phones. That these things always have been. There always been televisions and things of that sort. We're living in an age when people can get in a jet plane and in 3 hours they can be the other side of the country. You can be over in Europe in a very short period of time. So travel is unreal as compared to the way it was when I was a boy. I can remember many a time when my dad would be out farming And I can remember when he had both a tractor and mules. And my dad would put me up on the mule's back when he'd been out plowing in the field. Honestly now, I'm not 100 years old. I'm just 71. But I can still remember my dad putting me up there, and I'd hold on to the collar with those two big brass, handles that stuck up. And I'd sit there on that mule, and I was the biggest thing in the world. That was something else to me in those days. And so that's how I grew up. Well, anyway, to shorten this a bit, I had no real fascination with education. I was sort of an outdoor guy growing up. I used to raise horses and train horses on the farm. I used to camp out a lot, and that was what I did for recreation growing up as a kid. And I had no ambition to go to college, so I never took college preparatory courses. But as things would turn out, I ended up leaving home, being reasonably convinced that I didn't want to be a farmer. I know what it's like to pick cotton all day long in the field with everybody else that's out there, and to crop tobacco all day long, and to hoe corn. I've done all those kind of things as a young person, and that's because that was our way of life. That's how you lived, and all the kids would work on the farm. I'd get up in the morning before I get on the school bus and milk the cow, and my mom made her own butter, and we killed hogs and we killed cows and things, and when we go to the grocery store, it'd be just to get maybe salt or sugar or coffee or something like that. Most of the groceries were grown right out there in the garden. Well, anyway, I graduated from high school and headed off down to Florida. I had this fantasy about just seeing the world, and I'd never really been anywhere before off of the farm to amount to anything. And so I ended up down in Miami, Florida, and I got a place off of Biscayne Boulevard. My first employment was at a Sinclair service station pumping gas. I worked there for a while, and while I was down there, there was a singing group that came over from England. They were called the Beatles, and they would later publish an album called Revolution. And during those days, I had no idea what such things meant. It would be many years later that I would look back in reflection, and a lot of things would occur to me that I had never really understood before. And I just mention these things to create something of a timeline and something about my own history that will help you better understand this line of reasoning that I'm going to try to present to you this morning, which is going to be a progressive logic. I want to present to you some thoughts that involve progressive logic. And I think when you see it, when you see the logical progression of things throughout history, and even in my short lifetime, it might bring together a perspective that could be of service to you. So as I worked at the service station down there in Florida, I was continually being asked these questions, especially by the older generation. What was I going to do with my life? Are you going to pump gas the rest of your life? And I'd listen to what they had to say and brush it off. But most of them were trying to encourage me to go to college, and I wasn't really interested in going to college. Well, as the months passed by, I thought more and more about it, and eventually I had a cousin of mine that was enrolled at East Carolina University come by to see me down there in Florida. And he was going to work during the summer as a bellhop at the Dovell Hotel on Miami Beach. And he says, Dwight, he says, why don't you come on back up to North Carolina and go to college? And I said, well, I'm not really interested in going to college. I want to see the world. Well, he kept nagging at me through the summer as he worked down there. And I eventually decided I would go back to North Carolina and follow through with his encouragement and enroll. The short of it is I ended up getting a degree in philosophy at East Carolina University. I got a degree in psychology, and then I got a master's degree in the area of counseling. Dr. Clinton Pruitt called me up one day and said, Dwight, I've got a job opportunity for you down in Southern Pines if you're interested. He said, I think it would be perfect for you. And if you want to go down and interview for it, they got a job down there as a juvenile corrections counselor working for the state. So I came down, interviewed for the job, got it, and set up one of the first programs in this area here surrounding 5 counties as a juvenile corrections counselor. My job was to sit across the table from an age range of clients from 10 years old to 25 who were incarcerated from things ranging from truancy to murder. I know what it's like to sit across the table and talk to a 10-year-old boy that's in the system for cold-blooded murder. There was a guy at Caledonia Prison Farm, Scotland Neck, North Carolina, who was in prison for killing his wife. He chopped her up into little pieces with an axe and fed her to the hogs. The reason I'm telling you these things is because I want you to understand that I have some familiarity with the dark side of human nature. So in teaching this class, I want you to understand that I didn't just crawl out from under a rock. I know something about what's going on out here and how dangerous it is. And it's actually probably more dangerous than you even realize or that you've been told by the media or whatever. And so I want to develop some thoughts that are a little bit on the philosophical side, but I want you to understand that philosophy is not complicated. As a matter of fact, everybody in here is a philosopher. As a matter of fact, you're living out your philosophy at this very moment. Everybody has a philosophy of life, and philosophy just has to do with your worldview, what you believe to be true about life, what you believe to be meaningful about life. And so everybody is a philosopher. I didn't used to understand that, but I do now. Well, anyway, I want to develop some thoughts that, again, it's a sort of a logical progression that will help put a bigger picture on many things, even reaching back into ancient history. Well, if you go back into ancient history, what we do know about times past, one of the earliest archaeological digs that gives us some idea of previous empires and civilizations that have been out there was the Chaldean Empire. The Chaldeans were followed by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were followed by the Egyptian Empire. The Babylonians conquered the Egyptians. Eventually the Medes and Persians conquered the Babylonians. And then the Greeks conquered the Persians. So you had the Grecian Empire. And then the Romans conquered the Greeks. And so if you go on the internet even and look up some of these things, you'll find that it's there, and what I've told you thus far is rather accurate. Well, what's important about mentioning these things in sort of a chronological order of those empires as they emerged is the impact that they've had on our world and our country even to this very day. For instance, when I was at East Carolina studying philosophy, I studied Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, the Epicureans and the Stoics, the philosophical thinkers of that time period. Well, these were men that, for the most part, grew up within a 30-mile radius of Athens, Greece. And these were the great thinkers that were trying to answer some of life's biggest questions. And what are they? Well, they're the same that they are today. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Well, what authority determines what is right and what is wrong? And how do we know? So who does decide what is right and what is wrong? When we grow up and get married, have families, how many parents have experienced a child when you tell them, I don't want you to do that, or you have to be in at 11 o'clock, and your child looks at you and says, why? Why? Well, why would they ask a question like that? Because everybody by nature wants to rest their reasoning upon some ultimate authority. And so even in children, they will question the ultimate authority of a parent and say, okay, why? What is your reason for telling me I've got to be in at 11 o'clock? I don't agree. And so they're looking for ultimate authority. Well, my daddy ran into that with me. It's what's called a generation gap. And my daddy took his belt off and closed the gap. And so I came to understand very quickly that it was not very wise to question the ultimate authority of my dad. And so I don't know what your method of explaining things is, but anyway, as you know, the Greeks were those that have had a tremendous impact upon the politics of the world. As a matter of fact, when the Romans conquered the Greeks, a lot of their democratic system was built upon the thinking of Plato and his Republic. So Plato had a tremendous impact upon the world and in terms of future governments, even our own government. And so the concept of democracy and a representative government originated way back there during that time period. Well, when Alexander the Great, the Greek, conquered all of these regions of the world, which later became known as the Byzantine Empire, he had this challenge, and that was, how am I going to control these vast regions of the known world at that time that I've conquered? So he'd go into these countries and he'd conquer these vast territories. Well, how in the world was he going to control it? Well, he was a genius, and he came up with the idea of doing it through the means of education. And so he set up Greek schools all over the place. And he taught the younger generation coming along Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek politics. And so the generation that came along grew up knowing the Greek language, learning the Greek way of life and the Greek worldview. And it's a brilliant way to control people, is through education. Because how a person thinks and what a person believes to be true will determine their behavior. And that's an unrefutable truth. It's just the way it is. And so if you want to control human behavior, then all you got to do is control their mind and what they think about, what they believe to be true, or what they believe to be right or wrong. Eventually, the Roman Empire conquered the Grecian Empire. And Alexander the Great was so successful in his exploits that the common language spoken over in the Middle East area and what is called the Byzantine Empire was Greek. That was the primary language that was spoken. A lot of people do not know this. They've never been, introduced to this line of reasoning or kind of research. But when it comes to the Bible, when it comes to Christianity, the New Testament was written in Greek. And a lot of people do not know why it was written in Greek, because the Old Testament scripture from the Hebrews was in Hebrew or Aramaic, and so the reason the New Testament was written in Greek is because of the influence of Alexander the Great and his success in setting up these schools. When the Grecian Empire was divided, there were 4 generals. I won't go into all this, but one of them told me, set up a library in Alexandria, Egypt. And in that library, he included in the library the Old Testament scriptures called Septuagint. And the reason is because he wanted the generation coming along to be educated about the past. And the reason is because if you are not knowledgeable of the past, you will not know best how to live in the future. It was Hegel, the philosopher, who said that history teaches us that history teaches us nothing. And so if you're going to have a vision of what works in the future, the best way is look into the past and see what worked in the past. And if it didn't work, you make adjustments. And so wisdom then for living life can largely be based upon your knowledge of the past and what has worked. Well, anyway, some 2,000 years ago, and by the way, when you came in here, you wrote down March the 5th, 2016. And you wrote that down. And a lot of people do that every day and never really give thought as to why it is that it's 2016. Well, how do you get 2016? Well, it's simple. By adding 1 year at a time. Well, if you go backwards and subtract 1 year at a time, you eventually get back to the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1500s, 800. You go back to the 1st century. And the question is, what in the world happened some 2,000 years ago that would cause us today to still celebrate something that went on some 2,000 years ago? And those that are acquainted with the facts would know that some 2,000 years ago there was a court trial. The Romans had conquered the Greeks. The common language was Greek. And there was a man walking around over there in the Middle East claiming to be truth, claiming to be the truth. And it got some people pretty upset. And one thing led to another, and he was brought before the court and put on trial for claiming to be the truth. And so when Pilate, who was the governor in charge of that situation, that setting, inquired as to why this man was in his court, the accusation was set forth in the court proceedings that he claimed to be the truth. Many, many years ago, I just happened, for various reasons, to be reading that in Scripture. And as a philosophy major at East Carolina, something hit me just like a brick wall. And what it was a question that Pilate asked in that court. And the question he asked was, what is truth? What is truth? Well, I went to college back in the 60s, as a matter of fact, 1964. And I can tell you that as a young person, there came a point in my life when that question was very important to me. What is truth? Is there such a thing as truth? Is there such a thing as ultimate truth? Well, one of the reasons that I decided to pursue philosophy at East Carolina is because I wanted an answer. I wanted an answer. For me, I wanted an answer. If there's truth, I want to know what it is. And so, I studied philosophy. And in reading Plato and reading Aristotle and reading Socrates and many other philosophers of that time period and later, right on up to our present time, I discovered that when you get to the last chapter of any of those books, I was still asking the question, what is truth? Because they absolutely failed to give me an answer. They failed. Well, when Ptolemy set up the library in Alexandria, Egypt, and the entire culture of that time period was exposed to Greek thought and Greek philosophy. They were reading the same books I was reading at East Carolina, Plato's Republic. Socrates, I was taught by an Aristotelian authority when I was at East Carolina. Used to go over to his house and sit at his feet, and just with a hunger, I just wanted him to teach me. I wanted to know some answers to some very important questions. And when I'd come to the end of the conversation, when I'd picked his brain the best I knew how to pick his brain, I would always leave his house with a void on the inside and a sense that I just didn't quite get the answer. Didn't get the answer. And I'd read the books, and I finally got the degree. I didn't know any more after I got the degree than I did the first day I went into class. And that was my experience. And so when I was reading that question by Pilate, what is truth? I could absolutely identify with that, because that was my own experience. Well, as you know, the years passed by, and as you follow the history, you eventually study it in school. You'll study about the Age of Enlightenment, the Renaissance period, Renaissance meaning rebirth. There was a time period in American history that goes back to those times. I'd say the 16, 17, 1800s, that time period might be called the Age of Enlightenment or the Renaissance period. And a school of thought began to emerge that was unprecedented. Now, I know this because my job some years ago when I was in college was to find some answers to these things. And I found some. And I found that there was a way of thinking that was unprecedented during the Age of Enlightenment. And here's what it was. There were certain philosophers that concluded that we do not have the wherewithal, we do not have the tools to investigate an invisible dimension. And I sat and thought about that, and I thought within myself, well, I guess that's maybe true. Because in an invisible dimension, you can't see anything. I mean, how do you use hearing when you're talking about an invisible dimension? Now, when I talk about invisible dimension, I'm talking about a dimension where previous to that time period, that was the region of God, or the gods, plural, polytheism. And so, up until the Renaissance period, there was this thinking all throughout human history that over against the world of existing things, there was a spirit world. And the cause of everything in the physical world was out of the spirit world. And for lack of a better term, Plato referred to it as God, or the first principle. or the first cause. And so those terms became definitions of God, or whatever it was that started up everything that we see in this visible world. Well, that school of thought out of the Renaissance was, we don't have the tools to prove one way or another that there's even anything in an invisible dimension, or that there even is an invisible dimension. And so the idea began to emerge, what if there never was an invisible dimension? What if there has always just been a physical dimension? And if that's the case, we do have the wherewithal to investigate that, but we do not have the wherewithal to investigate an invisible world. And so, from the Renaissance period, a lot of people do not understand this, but the age of technology was born out of that kind of philosophical conclusion. You're wasting your time to spend mental energy trying to understand an invisible dimension. And so why invest mental energy doing that? Why not invest your mental energy in studying the world of existing things? And so that's exactly what began to happen. And as they delved deeper and deeper into the world of existing things in pursuit of the answer to the questions of life that really matter, like, where did we come from? Well, you don't find it by looking out that way. You find it by looking down this way in the world of existing things. There was a philosopher that eventually came along in the early 1800s, and the name was Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a German philosopher. He's one of many, but we don't have time to talk about all these guys. But I'll mention him, and the reason is because he was thoroughly convinced that it was an absolute waste of time to think about God in the classic sense that people had previously thought about God. That an intelligent person would invest his powers of reasoning in what could be known. So what can we know? Well, it became actually a law of science, the systematic investigation of observable phenomena. That's a law of science that is studied in high schools and in public schools to this very day. It's a system science, it's a systematic investigation of observable phenomena. Well, you can't systematically investigate something that's invisible. That which is not in this realm of what we call existence. And so a term began to be coined called existentialism in philosophy. Existentialism is the idea that the only reality is that which exists. Now you're probably sitting out there thinking to yourself, what in the Sam Hill am I doing here in this class? This is a gun class. And this guy hadn't mentioned guns yet. He hadn't mentioned laws yet. What in the world is this guy? Is this a Looney Tune? And you're probably thinking that, but I want to try to put you at ease, and I want you to understand that I am going somewhere with this. I'm going somewhere with this. And I promise you, if you're disappointed after I get done and all, at the end of the day, if you're just thoroughly disgusted with what you've spent your time doing today, I'll give you your money back. I will. And I'll give you your certificate too. I'm not in it. I enjoy what I'm doing right now. So please give me a little latitude and let me enjoy myself. Nietzsche set forth this idea that there is no God. And he had one problem. He did not have a real way, a substantive way of proving that there wasn't, and proving that his particular worldview was correct. He didn't have real physical evidence to prove, for instance, that the origin of our being was out of the forces of nature itself. Well, there was a guy that came along by the name of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a British biologist. And he came up with this theory because he had been influenced by this kind of thinking that originated out of Europe. The idea of existentialism. And the idea that we find all the answers to our big questions by a study of nature itself, that which exists. And so existentialism became a very important word. And in 1859, Charles Darwin published a book called The Origin of Species. And he introduced the world to the doctrine of biological evolutionism, which simply meant that the explanation of human existence and all forms of life is nature itself. And if you study nature, you can see this evolutionary process, and God is not really behind it, it's nature that's behind it. And just the forces of nature could give rise to more sophisticated forms of life. And so there's this evolutionary process. And so he began to travel around and do all kinds of archaeological digs and so forth, trying to prove and find evidence that there are these transitional forms where he could prove that man is in a constant state of evolution and the whole universe is in a state of evolution. He ran into something of a snag in that the founding fathers held a totally different view. Now, this is a critical point of what I'm going to say to you. The Declaration of Independence makes this statement. We were endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a statement in the Declaration of Independence. The two primary documents that provide us our way of life that resulted in America becoming the envy of the world are these two documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That comprises the government of the United States of America. And so the founding fathers believed that there's a God. They were so convinced of that when you get into the Constitution and you read, for instance, the 7th article of the Constitution of the United States, you will find in there a sentence, a phrase that says, "in the year of our Lord." I don't know what the ACLU is going to do about that, because to really get rid of Christianity, Obama says this is not a Christian nation. It's a Muslim nation, it's a Buddhist nation, it's a Hindu nation, it's everything. It's just a big melting pot of all kinds of religions, and the idea is they're all equal in some way. Well, that's not how the founding fathers thought in America. And so in our educational system, if we're going to teach what it means to be an American, if we do not teach what preserves this way of life, which is the worldview that people hold, it's your worldview that gives fixity to a way of life, so that your little grandchildren that are coming along, like I have little grandchildren about this high, and I'm hoping that they're going to be able to enjoy some of the freedoms that I enjoyed when I was a boy on the farm. And I will be successful in my influence to help turn this country back around to what made my life a great life when I was a kid. And what gives me the shivers at 71 years old when I see the comparison between how things are now and how it was when I was a kid. Well, I want our country to go back to what it used to be, and I don't want it to go forward to wherever in the world it's going. It scares the daylights out of me where this nation is going. And so back in the beginnings of this nation, the founders of this country believed in this view that God created, so much so that to hold public office from day one in this nation, You had to put your left hand on a King James Bible, raise your right hand toward heaven, and swear that you would uphold what? The Constitution of the United States of America. When you go into the military, you swear on a Bible that you will uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. Well, what are you swearing to uphold? You're swearing to uphold that God created the heavens and the earth. That's what you're swearing. You're swearing that you believe that He is really there. Well, in the 1850s, Darwin comes along with this theory that is antithetical. It's the very opposite of the view of the founders of the nation. It's the view that God did not create, that existence as we observe it today is a result of the forces of nature alone, with no intelligence on the other side, no invisible dimension, no invisible God, no God. And so here you got Friedrich Nietzsche saying God is dead, there is no God. You got Darwin coming along saying that man is an evolution, he's a product of evolution. Well, in logic, you have what is called the law of non-contradiction. Well, the law of non-contradiction essentially says that two opposites cannot simultaneously be true. Okay, if you've got one crowd over here saying, in the beginning God created, and you got somebody over here saying, we are a biological evolution, and this is the explanation of our existence, and the explanation of all forms of life is a process of biological evolutionism. Well, the idea that Darwin was setting forth and that Nietzsche was setting forth is that there is no God. So you have in logic the law of non-contradiction. Two opposites cannot simultaneously be true. Now I'm going to hit you with something you can't refute. You can try, but you can't do it. You can't almost have a God. You either do or you don't. I'll hit you with another truth you can't deny. There is no other explanation outside there either is a God or there is not a God. If there is not a God, Darwin has to be right by default, because there's no in-between explanation. You can't, again, almost have a God. You either do or you do not. If you do not have a God, then logic demands that the only explanation for human existence or any other kind of life form is a process of Darwinian evolutionism. So it's one or the other. And so the complexity of what we're talking about is reduced to just two alternatives. So either there is a God or there's not a God. And if there's not a God, then we evolve. Okay. There was a man, a professor by the name of Christopher Columbus Langdale. He's a Harvard Law professor back in the late 1800s from the Harvard Law School. And he began to read Darwin's writings and began to see, the line of reasoning. And and because man by nature would really like to be the one that decides what is right and what is wrong in life, rather than God. I mean, think about it. Let's just think about it naturally speaking. Do you think your kids would like it if you went in and said to your kids that are maybe young teenagers, look, you got a mind. I'm going to let you decide what's right and what's wrong in our home. And so if you want to stay out at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can do it. If you want to drive that car 100 miles an hour, that's your decision. You decide what's right and what's wrong. If you want to go have sex you know, go have sex. You decide what's right and what's wrong. If you're a teacher in a school, and you went to school and said, kids, listen, we got this stack of books here, and I'm going to leave it up to you. Do you want to let's study these books today, or you want to let's just have recess all day? You decide what's right and wrong, what's in your best interest. I guarantee you, boy, I'll tell you what, you'll ride by that school and everybody will be out on the playground and they'll be having recess. And so that's just the way it is. That's human nature. Human nature wants to be the center of the universe and actually decide, okay, I'm going to decide what is in my best interest and what is right for me. Well, everybody by nature would like, well, when Christopher Columbus Langdale came down and began to read Darwin, in the backdrop of his final decision about it, he fancied the idea of, okay, I would really, with my intellect as a Harvard Law professor, I would like to decide what is right and what is wrong. Because a lot of the things that are taught by God in the Bible, I don't agree with. And I think I'm capable of going out here and maybe having sex with anybody I want to, or you know, in business dealings. If I think it's the right thing to do, then that's what I'm going to do. And so I trust my own intelligence concerning my future and what I think is right. Well, that sells. It really does. People are enticed by that kind of thinking about having the liberty to decide what is right and what is wrong for yourself, and not somebody outside yourself, whether it's parents or law enforcement or God, telling you what is right and what is wrong, regardless of what you may think about it. So, Christopher Columbus Langdale goes back up to Harvard Law School and he introduced the case law study method. Now, some of you people that read and stay up, sort of up on politics and so forth, can connect with some of these things that I'm saying. But there's two views when it comes to the judicial system. And I used to work quite a bit in the judicial system as a counselor, so I know a little bit about it. I'm not a lawyer by any means, but I know a little bit about it. And I know that there is what is called judicial activism today, which is a major philosophy in the judicial system, where truth and what is right and what is wrong is not based on some absolutism where God defines forever what is right and what is wrong. When God says something is right, it's right forever. When God says something is wrong, it's wrong forever. And the Bible says, I am the Lord, I change not. So truth doesn't change. And so that concept of absolutes is always connected to the existence of God, who is the ultimate authority, who decides what is right and what is wrong. Now, if you do not believe that way, then right and wrong is decided by another system of authority. And the other and only other system of authority is man. So you either have God as the ultimate authority, or you have man as the ultimate authority. Well, if you're part of the intellectual elite, there's a strong inclination to want to believe that, okay, I can decide what is right and what is wrong. And so rather than basing our whole judicial system upon an antiquated belief in God that nobody really even believes because you can't even prove him, then why not base court rulings upon precedent cases. In other words, law is based on not the Constitution, but precedent cases of law. And so you look at the previous cases and you study what the court concluded in that particular case, and you base subsequent rulings upon precedent cases. That's what judicial activism is. It's where the judicial system becomes the ultimate authority in deciding what is right and what is wrong, which is in great measure what the United States Supreme Court has become. It's what the judicial system in America has become. And that is judges legislating from the bench because they believe that they can decide what is best for the nation rather than appealing to ultimate law vested in God. In 1925, there was a court trial in Dayton, Tennessee called the Scopes Monkey Trial. In that Scopes Monkey Trial, you had Clarence Darragh arguing for evolution and the idea that evolution should be taught in the public school system in Dayton, Tennessee. You had William Jennings Bryan arguing on the other side that man is not a biological evolution, as Darwin says, but that we are created by God. And true science is teaching that God created. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. They believed, the founding fathers believed, that was true science. Darwin's crowd believed that true science is a systematic investigation of observable phenomena, not invisible phenomena, like God. And so the contest was on in 1925 as to whether Darwinian evolutionism was going to be taught in the public school system. Well, if you go back and read the account, you will find that the court ruled in favor of creation. And they outlawed the teaching of Darwinian evolutionism in the public school system in Tennessee. Well, a few years go by, and in 1964, yours truly, Dwight Creech, ends up at East Carolina University. And lo and behold, what I run into is a gradual shift in the whole world view of the educational system in America. And I found myself sitting up there at East Carolina being systematically educated out of the view that there is a God. And systematically being taught that Darwinian evolutionism is true. And all of a sudden I discovered that in the textbooks, Darwinian evolutionism was being set forth and written in there as the absolute explanation for human existence. And I saw these drawings of man when he started out, you know, as this little something in a mud hole. When he crawls out of a mud hole and he starts creeping on the ground and he gets a little bit further and all of a sudden he's swinging from the trees, and then later you see him in a suit sitting in the United States Congress. And so man is this biological evolution. And I was being taught this as truth at East Carolina University. I was being taught that as truth at Pine Level High School in Johnston County, North Carolina. That evolution is the truth. Well, two opposites cannot simultaneously be true. But the textbooks did not say that in the beginning God created. Well, those of you that are at least 70 years old can remember in the public school system, we used to have preachers that would come by and teach chapel. We used to all have a Bible. We would have devotions in school. You had the 10 Commandments on the wall of the public school system. And people were not offended by any of this. And people would take their hat off when a pastor would come by. And they were polite to women. And the world was very different way back then, but it began to change when I was at East Carolina University, big time, it began to change. Well, here's where I'm going with this. I spent some time when I was in college traveling. I spent time out at Berkeley University. I got on a plane, flew to Europe, hitchhiked around, spent a summer over there just hitchhiking around, largely just trying to find myself, trying to figure out, how am I going to live, and by what philosophy am I going to live? I mean, what is going to determine the choices that I make? I mean, when I go out with a girl, how am I going to behave myself, and what are going to be the reasons for the way I behave myself when I go out? And so I began to think about all these things, and I began to realize the consequences of being wrong. And it was scary. It was really scary, because I got to thinking to myself, now, if I just counsel out the idea of God, it's not going to prevent me from dying one day. And what if I'm wrong? And I live my entire life without God, and I go out into whatever is after death to find out there is God. And so the most relief that I could find was at the bottom of a Budweiser bottle. And so I would go down to the Coach and 4 and the Fiddler's 3, I'd get drunk. Absolutely drunk. And I hitchhiked all over Europe, drinking wine and trying to talk to any wizard I could find anywhere that seemed to have any answers. And about 40-something years ago, I came to a radical conclusion. And the radical conclusion is this. There are only two possibilities when it comes to everything. There either is a God or there is not a God. If there is not a God, then evolution has to be true. If evolution is true, then I have to decide what is right and what is wrong for me. I have to do that. We are now living in a world where just about everybody is doing that. This is not unprecedented. After Moses died and Joshua took over and Joshua died, there's what's called the time of the Judges. And if you go and pull out a Bible and read the last chapter of the book of Judges, here's what you will read. And every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And folks, that's where we are in America today. Because we're living in a nation that has turned its back on God and has outlawed God. Now, you may be offended by this, but let me tell you what your future is. If you believe with all your soul there is no God and that Darwin is right, then here's going to be your future. You're going to die. You're going to be buried. You're going to be put in a box. You're going to be put in the ground. And whatever your life has amounted to in the way of education, in the way of popularity, fame, possessions, you're going to be put in a box with absolutely nothing but your naked body that's going to rot. The maggots are going to eat you. I'm not trying to be ugly. I'm just telling you the facts. This is the truth. You're going to dissolve in that box. In a very short period of time, the people that have known you will stop thinking about you. And after about 10 years go by, you'll be a foggy memory in most people's minds. When 100 years passes, you will be remembered about as much as you remember people that lived 100 years before you. The truth is, who do we think we are? How much importance can we give to ourselves by ourselves? How are you going to get out of the box? Or is your conclusion you don't. We evolve by the forces of nature. We're going to dissolve and be absorbed back into nature. The only way that we could ever live again would be for there to be another Big Bang, billions and billions of years, and the cosmic lottery of somehow or other all the elements in the universe coming back together to recreate you to be the same person that you are right now. Now, either that is what you believe, because logic cannot take you any other way, or you believe what I believe, and that is John's Gospel, chapter 11, where Jesus Christ made this statement to Martha. He said, Martha, this was after her brother Lazarus had died. He said, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. If a man believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. And then he asked her a question. He said, believest thou this? He then said, take me to the grave where your brother is. She said, Master, he's already been dead 4 days. He stinks by now. The Lord said, take me there. There was a multitude of people from Jerusalem who had traveled to Bethany because they knew Mary and Martha and they knew Lazarus. And they wanted to show their condolences and try to be some comfort to the family. And they were all there. And Jesus Christ stood outside that grave and proved his identity as it was proclaimed in that court that Pilate presided over, or would preside over in a short period of time. He claimed to be the truth. He claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. He claimed to be the resurrection from the dead. I am a Bible-believing Christian to the core. I don't care what anybody thinks about it. You're going to have to die. I'm certainly going to die one of these days. And you're going to have to go out and face eternity on what you believe to be true concerning what's coming. I just happen to believe that I am going to get out of the box. I do. I believe it with all my soul, because if I'm not going to get out of the box, life has no point. Which is why Klebold and Harris went to Columbine School and killed about 15 people and then committed suicide, is because they were educated by the public school system into believing in Darwinian evolutionism. And if Darwin was right, I submit to you that life has no point. You're headed toward the grave like a freight train. You're going to dissolve in the ground. And that's going to be the end of you. And whatever importance you give yourself is just that. It's the importance you give yourself. And what does that mean to your neighbor? Nothing. It means nothing. Because everybody is trying to basically, I guess, impregnate themselves with their own sense of self-importance. And that's why when you go out of this room here, you go out here in the general public, there'll be a guy out there waiting for you with one of these in his hands that'll put it around your neck and cut your throat and sit on your dead body and eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and never skip a beat without a conscience. Now, when I was at Berkeley, I remember some men taking their clothes off and streaking across the campus naked. When I came back to East Carolina, I was somewhat surprised at that time, because a lot of what I understand now I didn't understand at that time. A young man took his clothes off and just outside of Joyner Library, started running toward Wright Auditorium. And it caused quite a stir because everybody coming out of the library were standing out there seeing this sight as this naked man runs across campus. And in hot pursuit, about 30 yards behind him was campus police. They never caught him. My wife and I were at Tampa University sometime later. A man jumped the hedges on the boulevard, started running right down the middle of the boulevard, stark naked. My wife had never seen anything like this before, and she said, "Look," she said, "that man is crazy." And at the time, we just both chuckled and, agreed, yeah, he's crazy. But the years would pass by, and I would think back on my experience at Berkeley and my wife's remark down there at Tampa. And here's what I grew to understand, and that is that young man was not crazy. I guarantee you that if you could find out something about where he came from, he probably came from an affluent home. He probably had a credit card in his pocket that his parents provided him. He probably had a 4.0 grade point average, possibly, I don't know. So why would he run down the road naked? And the answer is he was making a philosophical statement. Now don't laugh. Think about it. Who said naked is naked? God said naked is naked. Who said you ought to wear clothes? God said you ought to wear clothes. But if there is no God and you're educated out of the view that there is a God, then who decides what's naked? Who decides that? Who decides how a woman ought to dress? I mean, should she wear a bra? Men don't. We have gotten to a point in our society where if you think that you're a woman when you are a man, then society has to accept you as being a woman even though you are a man. Our society is so confused that if two women want to get married, it's as legitimate as a man and a woman getting married. Or if two men want to get married, it's as legitimate as a man and a woman getting married. There are no definitions anymore, folks. Everybody's got their own definition. Now, some of you look at some of these thoughts and you say, really, if somebody wants to think that way, that's their right. But listen, you're going to have grandchildren one day that are going to be about this high, and they're going to be going to a public school or to a private school. And your government is going to tell you that if a boy in that school wants to go into your little girl's bathroom and watch her go over there and sit on the commode, that if you say anything about it, the next thing you're going to see is the ACLU and a lawyer representing them, and they're going to sue the socks off of you, and you're going to pay. And if you're a photographer, and I'm a professional photographer, and I refuse to photograph certain weddings, then I'm going to pay. Our country is changing, folks. It is changing. And the responsibility of taking it back to sanity is on you and me, because the government is all buying for the people. It's us. And if we continue to let Washington and Raleigh dictate to us what runs roughshod over common sense and just plain sanity, then who can we blame but ourselves? It's our responsibility to take our country back. And in my little corner, that's what I'm going to do. And I don't want anybody trying to push me around about it. I am a Bible-believing Christian, and I'm not ashamed of it. And I'll tell you this, people have tried to put me in a corner. It ain't gonna happen. It ain't gonna happen. Somebody wants to sit down with me that's a Darwinian evolutionist, you better have your act together. Because I'll rip you apart. I've debated 2 times at Sand Hills Community College. And I've had people sitting out there, 20 of them with PhDs. Every one of them died in the wool evolutionists. And me right there alone by myself in front of these people that are like animals toward me. Very unkind, very unkind. None of them gave me something that had reason and substance to it, that would persuade me away from my convictions that my view is right. But what I did run into was an emotion and an anger and a hostility you would not believe. Unbelievable. And so I try to top off this class with the ultimate politically incorrect thing. The Bible says, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven. I will forgive their sins and I will heal their land. If you're in a church where the preacher is spineless and will not address these issues, you need to get out of it and find you a church where a preacher stands up there and tells the truth. If you've got your kids on a public school system, you better be aware of what they're being taught every day. Our kids belong to us. They do not belong to the state of North Carolina or to the teachers in the school. They belong to parents. And it's our solemn responsibility to monitor what goes in their heads. And that's why I favor private Christian education. Christian education. But I begin every class with a prayer. You don't have to pray if you don't want to. I don't want to force anybody to do anything. But I begin every class with a prayer. And if you will extend to me a little space, I'd like to do just that. So let's pray. Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for life. I thank you for the blessing that's been personally mine to grow up in a nation that is, without question, the envy of the world. I thank you for the opportunities that I have as a free man with a First Amendment to our very Constitution that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. I thank you that I live in a country where there's a Second Amendment that keeps in place the First, a militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I pray that we would open our eyes and see the responsibility that's ours and the power that has been given to us by the founders of this nation. They've empowered us with the means of preserving fixity to this nation so that this way of life might continue. And I pray that we might ultimately realize that there is a God in heaven whose name is Jesus Christ, and that we're all going to have to stand before him and answer to him one day. And I believe you're coming soon. And I just pray that our influence might be that which would direct people toward you, to the end that they might come to know you in truth. Bless this day, keep us safe, and I just thank you for all these people that are here and that have had the patience to listen to these remarks. I make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to take a quick break and go to the restroom and come back as soon as you can.